Imagine planting a flower, and a week later it completely changes its color. This isn't magic and it's not Photoshop. This is a real miracle of nature that happens in every garden, and often we simply don't notice these changes. Today we're going to talk about chameleon flowers, ones that change their appearance right before our eyes. Maybe you've noticed that a hydrangea that was pink suddenly turned blue, or seen a petunia that blooms violet, but a few days later becomes a completely different shade. This isn't a mistake or a defect. It's a natural process embedded in the very nature of the plant. And today we'll figure out why this happens, which flowers are capable of changing color, and how to use this knowledge in your garden. Phlox, masters of subtle shades. Phlox are magical plants, and if you didn't know it yet, they have the ability to change color. Especially this applies to phlox with bicolor blooms. These plants demonstrate some of the most interesting and graceful transformations in the world of flowers, which you can observe throughout the entire summer season. Some varieties of phlox bloom with a very contrasting center and petals. For example, the center can be intensely red or deep purple, while the petals are light pink, almost white, or with barely noticeable pink tones. But as the flower ages, these two colors become less contrasting and begin to blend into each other. The center seems to blur and loses its sharpness, and the petals can also darken or lighten depending on the specific variety. This happens because the pigments in the petals begin to distribute more evenly across the entire flower surface, and the boundary between the center and petals gradually erases and becomes less visible. If you look at phlox at the beginning of its blooming, you'll see clear, distinct lines dividing the different colors. This creates the impression that the flower was painted very carefully, with sharp boundaries between shades. But after a week or two, these lines become softer, more blurred, and more delicate. This creates a very tender, romantic effect when the flower seems to glow from within, and all the shades smoothly transition into each other, creating a complex, multi-layered color effect. The process of this transformation can be explained by the biochemistry of the petal. Young petals contain concentrated pigments in certain cells, which creates sharp color boundaries. As the flower ages, these pigments begin to diffuse, spreading more evenly throughout the petal cells. Moreover, some pigments begin to degrade under the influence of light and oxygen, which leads to softening and blurring of the colors. Phlox are very sensitive to air and soil moisture. In dry, hot weather, their colors can look more dull and faded, losing vibrancy and depth. But in cool, humid weather, colors become brighter and more saturated, acquiring depth and richness. This is because moisture in the petals can affect how the petals reflect and refract light, making colors more vivid and intense. Water molecules in the petal tissues act as a natural color enhancer, making pigments more visible and more pronounced. Interesting fact, if you remove the dead or faded flowers from phlox, the new flowers that bloom later are often even brighter and more beautiful than the first flowers from the same plant. This is because the plant directs energy and nutrients to new flowers rather than spending them on maintaining and supporting old, fading flowers. Phlox, as it were, decides to start anew with brighter and more beautiful blooming, focusing all its resources on new inflorescences. Phlox varieties with names containing the word eye or glacier are known for their particularly contrasting centers and petals. For example, the variety Bright Eyes has a dark red center and pink petals, while Glacier is known for its white center and pink or red petals. These varieties provide a spectacle of dynamic color change that you can observe throughout the summer season, especially if you've planted several bushes nearby and they bloom at different times. The growing conditions of phlox also affect the intensity of color changes. Phlox growing in full sun and receiving adequate moisture demonstrate more dramatic and pronounced color transformations. Phlox growing in partial shade or in dry soil may show less impressive color changes. This is because pigment production in plants requires energy, and a plant under stress or lacking sufficient nutrition cannot produce pigments in the same quantity. To maximize the color change effect in phlox, make sure the plant receives enough light, regular watering, and good fertilizer. In summer, during the hottest period, you may need additional watering to ensure the soil around the phlox doesn't dry out completely. Use fertilizer with sufficient phosphorus content, which promotes the development of brighter and fuller flowers. Hellebore Winter Wizard. Hellebore is a wonderful plant that blooms in winter and early spring when the rest of the garden sleeps under snow and ice. This plant possesses one of the most amazing and long-lasting abilities to transform color, which can last for weeks, and sometimes even months, turning the hellebore into a true work of art. Young hellebore flowers often have a greenish tint, sometimes even with a delicate yellow glow in the center or on the edges of the petals. At this moment, the flower looks almost modest, as if it's just beginning to reveal its secrets. But as the flower ages and develops, an amazing transformation occurs. It can become more pink, acquiring warm, peachy shades. Then the color can shift to purple or red, creating deep, saturated tones. In some cases, the hellebore can become almost black, acquiring a grim, majestic appearance. This process can take several weeks, sometimes even a month or more, and if you carefully observe and even take photos every week, you'll be able to notice the gradual, almost imperceptible change in color day by day. Some hellebore varieties, such as Hellebris niger, Christmas rose, bloom almost white or cream-colored, looking almost like snowflakes, but as it ages, pinkish or greenish tones begin to appear, creating a very interesting and complex palette. Young flowers of this variety look almost unearthly clean and white, but over time they acquire character and depth, becoming much more visually interesting. This creates a very interesting effect when the plant has flowers simultaneously at different stages of color change, from light green, almost white young flowers to deeply colored, saturated old flowers. This creates a natural color gradient on the plant, which looks like a work of art. Another popular hellebore variety, Hellebris X hybridus, demonstrates even more impressive color transformations. These hybrid varieties are available in a huge range of colors, including white, pink, red, purple, yellow, and even green. And each of these varieties has its own unique story of color transformation. Some start light and become darker, others start dark and become lighter, and some go through an entire spectrum of colors, transitioning from one shade to a completely different one. Hellebore also reacts to air and soil temperature. In harsh winters, when the temperature drops below freezing and stays at low levels for weeks, its colors are often deeper and more intense, almost like gemstones glowing from within. But if the winter is mild and warm, with frequent thaws, the flowers can be paler and more delicate. This is because cold stimulates the production of more pigments in the plant as a protection against frost. The plant, as it were, prepares itself for extreme conditions by producing additional pigments that protect cells from damage by ice and frost. Moreover, the intensity of winter sunlight affects the color of the hellebore. Hellebores that grow in an open place and receive a lot of winter sun usually have brighter and more saturated colors. Hellebores that grow in the shade of evergreen trees or in very shaded places often look paler. Hellebore prefers partial shade and moist, well-draining soil rich in organic matter such as compost or well-rotted manure. In such conditions, flowers develop more fully and demonstrate brighter and more saturated colors. If you want to get the most beautiful hellebore with the brightest and most interesting color transformations, make sure it receives morning and midday sun, but is protected from hot afternoon sun, and that the soil around the plant never dries out completely. Hellebore also appreciates mulching, which helps retain soil moisture and keeps roots cool. Although hellebore is a winter wizard, its flowers remain beautiful for a long time, often staying fresh and beautiful throughout the spring. This means you can enjoy a slow, gradual color transformation over a very long time, making hellebore one of the most rewarding plants for observing natural processes. Morning Glory, Daily Performer. Morning Glory, or Pharbitis, is a climbing plant with beautiful tubular flowers that possesses a unique and almost theatrical ability to change color. But unlike other plants, Morning Glory does this every day, creating a constant show and spectacle in your garden that changes from dawn to dusk. Some varieties of Morning Glory can look completely different depending on the time of day and weather conditions. The Scarlet O'Hara Morning Glory blooms bright red, almost crimson, during the cool hours of early morning. But as the day progresses and the temperature rises, especially in hot, sunny weather, the flower can fade and become a lighter, paler shade of red, sometimes even acquiring pink or orange tones. This is because the pigments in the flower, anthocyanins, begin to degrade under intense sunlight and high temperature. Additionally, high temperature can cause water to evaporate from the petal tissues, making the color less bright and less saturated. Other morning glory varieties, such as blue morning glory or heavenly blue, Ipomoea purpurea, heavenly blue, show the opposite and even more amazing process. When the flower first blooms in the early morning, in a cool, dewy atmosphere, it can be delicate blue or even light purple, looking like little pieces of sky. But if you look at the same flower at noon, when the sun is high in the sky and the temperature reaches its peak, it can become almost pink or even purple, completely unlike its morning incarnation. This color change occurs because the pH of the plant's cell sap changes under the influence of sunlight and heat, and this, in turn, changes the color of the anthocyanins. Anthocyanin molecules change their structure depending on pH, which leads to different colors. Morning glory is also very responsive to soil and air moisture. Well-watered morning glories, growing during a humid period, produce brighter and more saturated flowers. But if the soil is dry for an extended period and the air is dry, especially in hot days, flowers can look paler, wilted, and less attractive. Sometimes, during severe drought, flowers may not fully open or close earlier than usual. Interesting fact, if the weather is especially hot and dry, morning glory flowers can close early, at noon, to protect themselves from extreme heat and moisture loss. They open again at the end of the day or the next morning when the temperature drops and air humidity increases. This means that on a single day you can see several full performances of the flower opening and closing, each time with different color shades. Another interesting aspect of morning glory is that each flower lives only one day. The flower blooms early in the morning and closes in the evening or at night, and the next day this happens with the next flower. This means that every day morning glory produces new flowers, often dozens or even hundreds, creating a constant show of blooming and color transformations. This makes morning glory particularly interesting to observe, as the plant constantly renews and regenerates. Morning glory prefers hot, sunny places and well-draining soil. Although it is drought-tolerant, it blooms best if the soil is slightly moist. For maximum blooming and the brightest flowers, make sure the morning glory receives at least 6 to 8 hours of direct sun per day and is watered regularly, especially during hot, dry periods. Roses, flowers with character. Roses, the queens of the flower world, and they too possess the ability to change color, although this process is less obvious and more subtle than in some other plants. The rose's ability to change color and shade depends on the variety, growing conditions, season, and even time of day. Some rose varieties, especially Old English roses and romantic varieties such as English rose or Austin roses, can change color as the flower develops and opens. The rose blooms in one shade as a tight bud, and as the petals gradually open over several days and the flower reaches its full, lush maturity, the shade can noticeably change. For example, a rose can bloom deep crimson or crimson red, and as it ages and opens, its petals can fade and become lighter, more purple, violet, or even almost lilac. The variety Munstead Wood is an excellent example of this. The rose starts almost black-red and becomes more purple with age. Roses are very, very sensitive to air temperature. Roses cut on a hot summer day, when temperatures exceed 30 degrees, often look paler and less bright, with a seemingly faded, diluted color, than roses of the same variety cut on a cool morning when temperatures are below 15 degrees. This is because heat promotes the degradation of pigments in the petals and causes water to evaporate from petal tissues. On the other hand, roses grown in a cool climate or during cool seasons, such as late autumn or early spring, usually have deeper, fuller, and more saturated colors. A rose grown in Europe in a cool climate often has a more intense color than a rose of the same variety grown in a hot climate. Additionally, roses respond to humidity and water quality. Roses grown in good humidity conditions and watered with soft water often look brighter, fresher, and more attractive. But if conditions are dry, especially if accompanied by hot weather, flowers can be less bright and more wilted. Interesting fact, Some rose varieties, such as the Ingrid Bergman rose, which is a classic red rose, can change color depending on the time of year and season. In summer, when the weather is hot, they can be lighter and less intense. But in autumn, when temperatures drop and it becomes cooler, they become deeper, redder, and more saturated. This creates an interesting effect when the rose seems to go through different seasons of color throughout one year, showing its maximum beauty in autumn. Some bicolor rose varieties, such as Autumn Sunset or Café Latte, demonstrate particularly interesting and beautiful color changes. A young flower can be bright orange or red, and as it develops and opens, it transitions into warmer, copper, and golden tones, and sometimes even acquires brownish or beige tones. This creates the sensation that you are looking at a sunset frozen in the form of a flower, or a cup of coffee with milk from which steam rises. These varieties are especially popular for weddings and special events because they look very elegant and romantic. Soil quality and fertilizers also affect the color of roses. Roses growing in fertile, well-fertilized soil rich in organic matter and microelements usually have brighter and fuller color. Roses growing in poor, depleted soil often look paler and less healthy. To get the most beautiful roses with the most intense and attractive colors, make sure they receive full sun, minimum 6 to 8 hours per day. Grow in well-draining soil rich in organic matter. Receive regular watering and regular fertilization. Removing faded flowers, a process called deadheading, also promotes the production of more beautiful and bright flowers throughout the season. Peonies, the pinnacle of beauty. Peony is one of the most luxurious, most beautiful, and longest-living plants in the garden, and it too possesses an interesting and delicate ability to change color. Although the color change in peonies is less dramatic and less obvious than in some other plants, it still creates a beautiful and romantic effect, adding depth and character to the flower. Young peony petals, when the flower is just beginning to open from a tight, packed bud, often have a lighter and more delicate shade than the mature petals inside the flower. When the peony is just beginning to bloom, its outer petals can be almost pastel, delicate, airy, and almost transparent, looking like silk or tulle. But as the flower fully opens over several days and the inner, protected petals open, the color becomes more saturated, fuller, and deeper. This is especially noticeable in varieties with intense, deep coloring, such as red peonies, the Carl Rosenfield variety, or dark purple and black peonies, such as Black Beauty or Black Parrot. This process can be explained by sun protection. The outer petals of a peony experience strong exposure to sunlight and ultraviolet rays during bud development. This exposure can cause partial degradation of pigments on the outer petals, making them lighter. Inner petals are protected from light and develop in more favorable conditions, so they retain more intense and fuller color. If a peony blooms in hot summer weather, its color is often paler and less intense than if it bloomed in cool, mild weather of spring or even in the cooler part of summer. This is one of the main factors that affects the appearance of a peony and its attractiveness. Peonies that bloom in spring, when the weather is still cool, almost fresh, and temperatures rarely exceed 20 degrees, usually look much brighter, more beautiful, and more impressive than late peonies that bloom in early summer, when hot weather has already set in and temperatures often exceed 25 degrees. The difference can be quite substantial, and one and the same variety can look completely different depending on when it blooms. Moreover, the age of the peony plant itself affects the color and quality of the flowers. Young peonies, only a few years old and not yet having gained full strength, often produce less bright, less full, and less luxurious flowers. Buds can be small, and flowers may not fully open. But as the peony grows, develops, accumulates nutrients, and gains strength, its flowers become more and more luxurious, full, lush, and bright with each passing year. An old, well-established peony, 20 years old or older, can produce absolutely stunning, huge flowers that are significantly brighter, larger, and more beautiful than the flowers of a young peony of the same variety. This means that a peony is an investment in the future. The first years of blooming may be modest, but over time the plant will reward you with magnificence. Peonies also respond to nutrition levels and micronutrient availability. Peonies that receive sufficient phosphorus and potassium usually produce brighter, more beautiful and fuller flowers. Phosphorus is especially important for flower development, as it participates in energy production and pigment synthesis. Potassium helps flowers stay fresh, turgid, and bright longer, preventing premature fading and petal drop. Interesting fact: cut peonies change color and appearance after cutting. When you cut a peony in the garden and place it in a vase with water in a cool room, where the temperature is significantly lower than outside, the flower often becomes even brighter and more saturated. This is because in a cool indoor environment, the process of pigment degradation slows down, and the peony, as it were, shows its true, maximally bright and beautiful color. A cut peony can last in a vase for 2 to 3 weeks, slowly fading and changing shade, giving you a long period to enjoy its beauty. To get the most beautiful peonies with the brightest and most intense colors, make sure they are planted in a place with full sun, minimum 6 hours of direct sun, in fertile, well-draining soil rich in organic matter such as compost. Peonies prefer slightly acidic or neutral soil. Provide them with adequate watering during the growth and blooming period, especially during dry weather. Use fertilizer rich in phosphorus during early growth and bud development to support the production of bright, beautiful flowers.